Like a Hollywood studio, major Hollywood films, Hollywood level stuff. Some of your favorite Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood Pack. Some of your favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood studio. Hollywood Pack is the emotion of a Hollywood film. For big Hollywood blockbuster. I'm not in Hollywood. I'm in Hollywood. Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. That's Hollywood mess up. Your favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood films. He's a big Hollywood cinematographer. Favorite Hollywood films. The Hollywood scene. Hollywood gun sound. Favorite Hollywood film. Does Hollywood know something? Some of your favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood films. It doesn't even work in Hollywood. Your favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Hollywood, which for a Hollywood film. Your favorite Hollywood films. Legit Hollywood studio. Epic Hollywood style production. Hollywood films for a Hollywood actors. Your favorite Hollywood films. In Hollywood, if you on a Hollywood. Your favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood films. The Hollywood system. Hollywood films. I'm your host. Hollywood films. I'm your host. Hollywood gun packs. Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Major Hollywood films in these Hollywood films. Major Hollywood favorite Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Like a Hollywood studio. Don't understand Hollywood at all. Your favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Old Hollywood. Major Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Hollywood blockbusters. Hollywood productions. Hollywood type thing. And Hollywood films. So you're getting the Hollywood. Hollywood was like favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Like come on Hollywood. It's a Hollywood studio. It's Hollywood baby. Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Hollywood right now. Hollywood films. Some Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Major Hollywood production. Favorite Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood quality. Hollywood. The Hollywood system. Hollywood level. Favorite Hollywood films. And Hollywood Pack. Just Hollywood films. In Hollywood. Favorite Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. And Hollywood studio. A Hollywood studio. Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. And of Hollywood. Favorite Hollywood film. Your favorite Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Hollywood was like, hey, watch some more Hollywood. Favorite Hollywood film. Hollywood films. Hollywood. One of some of your favorite Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood director. Big Hollywood film. Whole Hollywood sets. Hollywood films. Your favorite Hollywood films. Your favorite Hollywood film. Like a Hollywood giant soft spot for big Hollywood action stars in Hollywood. Hollywood films. Hollywood production. Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. The Hollywood set. Favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood film. The Hollywood are huge Hollywood. Big Hollywood films. Hollywood film. In Hollywood. Favorite Hollywood. Hollywood effects. Your Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Hollywood. Your favorite Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood. Favorite Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. In Hollywood. Favorite Hollywood. Favorite Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Big Hollywood rigs. Hollywood films. Hollywood films. Come on, Hollywood film. Even in Hollywood films. Favorite Hollywood films. Like that Hollywood mess up. Hollywood slip up in Hollywood.
This ain't Hollywood.
Hollywood gun pack. Hollywood when left Hollywood. Hollywood really is where you want to be. It's that Hollywood being Hollywood and Hollywood has, but Hollywood doesn't. Our Hollywood in Hollywood instead of Hollywood's gonna than the Hollywood feature film. Like Hollywood, the Hollywood on in Hollywood. You watch Hollywood. What a Hollywood's gonna Hollywood. Oh, Hollywood's in Hollywood. Hollywood feature films. Is that your Hollywood? Waiting for Hollywood. That's in Hollywood. Hollywood got that Hollywood land of Hollywood. Hollywood's in Hollywood. That Hollywood is how Hollywood's version of this. I think Hollywood of Hollywood. Like a Hollywood studio in Hollywood. Hollywood does a Hollywood director.
So Hollywood
Hollywood has Hollywood with